Okay, so let's get started. In this lesson today, we're going to be looking at John in Ephesus. So what's his connection to the city of Ephesus? John he was born in a small village called Bethsaida. That's next to the Sea of Galilee. He's very familiar with Jerusalem. It's one of the things that scholars note about John is that there have been many archaeological discoveries that we get the description originally from John. And John's very accurate about Jerusalem. So we know that John must have lived at some point in Jerusalem between the time of Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. But then he moves from the land of Israel at some point, and he moves to the city of Ephesus, which is in Asia Minor. And so as we work our way through the Gospel of John, what we're going to end up doing is we want to keep one foot in Israel. And that's the Jewish message of John's Gospel, that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah and the King of Israel. And then, of course, everything that comes along with that statement. But then on the other hand, what we have to do is we have to keep one foot in Asia Minor. This is where John's community is. The first group that read his gospel or heard these stories, the way he wrote them in the gospel that we have, is in Asia Minor. So this photo that's our background today, this is from the ancient city of Ephesus. And actually, it's what it looks like today in modern day if you travel to Turkey. But it's the ruins of the city of Ephesus. This is called the Library of Celsus. Now, this particular library was not there in John's day. So the Romans commissioned the building of this in 110 AD, so likely after John's death. But scholars have suggested that this is the location of a place that Paul would have been at. So some suggest, because in the book of Acts, Paul mentions, when he's in Ephesus, he mentions the lecture hall of Tyrannus. And so that was back in the 50s. And what scholars think is that this may have been the place of that lecture hall where Paul would have been talking about the good news. They found an inscription that mentions an auditorium. Now, it's nothing definitive, but a beautiful place for those who have been to Ephesus. If you haven't, wonderful city to go visit. All right, so let's consider John in Ephesus. This is going to be where John ultimately went to live, where he's going to write his gospel from, where his audience is, where his community is. And that's going to be for both this gospel, the Gospel of John, and the book of Revelation. So if we go to a map, this is a map of the Mediterranean Sea, the blue in the middle, and then all the countries that surround it. Now, Israel is down in the lower southeast corner, that right-hand corner of your screen, but that's the southeast corner of the map. The star you see is about where Jerusalem would be. If we go around the map, you have Egypt down here at the bottom. We go up to the left corner at the boot there, that's Italy, and you have the city of Rome. You have Athens, Greece, right here in the middle. And then in this region right here, which is modern-day Turkey, you have an area called, or known as, Asia Minor. Okay? Now, John, as I mentioned, is from Israel. Israel is the place where Jesus' ministry takes place. And of course, all the events within John's gospel, they all take place here in the land of Israel. Jerusalem sits up on a ridgeline, it's up in the mountains, and that's just west of the Dead Sea. Then if we go straight to the north is where you get the Sea of Galilee. That's really a stopping off point for the Jordan River, which connects the Sea of Galilee to the Dead Sea. And then you go to where John was from. That's Bethsaida, small fishing village. It's actually on the northeast corner of the Sea of Galilee. So this is where John was born, where he was a disciple of Jesus, and where he would have lived for a long time before actually leaving and going to Ephesus. Now, John would have been either living in Jerusalem with that early church movement, perhaps splitting time back at the Sea of Galilee, But he's not stopped being Jewish. He, just like Paul, continues to engage within Judaism. Christianity is a sect within Judaism in the first century. He's regularly going to Jerusalem, to the festivals, and he's Jewish and sees Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah. Now, at some point, though, he's going to leave. Now, we don't know exactly when, but scholars have suggested that either around the time that there was the war with Rome, this is 66 AD to 70 AD, in 70 AD, ultimately the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed. That may have been the catalyst for many Jews to leave the land of Israel. And then we would say, okay, he leaves Israel, where does he go? Well, he heads across the sea to a region called Asia Minor and the city of Ephesus. Now, right there, we always need to be questioning the text, why, or why things would happen. It's very good, a way of exploring the text. You say, or exploring not just the text, but exploring the context around which our Bible was written. Why head here? Well, besides the fact that Ephesus is a leading city of the ancient world, it is really the place where the early church, where early Christianity is incubating. Now, this newfound faith in Messiah Jesus, it's again still a sect within Judaism. It's finding its legs, and the area where all of that happens, where the early church is finding its way, is happening up here in the region of Asia Minor. So if we go and we look at that region and we say, how much of our New Testament is written to or by people who are from or in this area that we know as Asia Minor? So if we just go down the list, you have Ephesians. Paul spent 2 years there in Ephesus. And again, that's a highly influential and leading city of the day. And what's important about Ephesus, as a port city and a huge, like New York City, port city, the entire world, in a sense, is going through Ephesus. And so the gospel could easily spread as the ships came in and out, trading their goods. Now, if we go right across from Ephesus, you have the city of Corinth. That's another port city. Paul stayed there for 18 months and ends up having to write 2 letters to them for all the issues that they're having. Then if we go a little bit to the east, you have Colossians, and then you have Galatians, 1st and 2nd Timothy. Timothy is from Lystra, but then he ends up moving to Ephesus. Luke is from Asia. By the time you add in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and the book of Revelation, you realize that the majority of your New Testament is written by people in and around Asia Minor, and it's written to people that are in and around Asia Minor. And so what we have to realize is, just like understanding the culture and the history of Israel when we're studying the stories of Jesus in the Gospels, when we go outside of there, it's important that we understand the stories and the history of the areas with which those letters were written and where the church was really beginning to flesh itself out. Okay, so let's go to a timeline real quick. If we look and say, well, Jesus' birth happens at the turn of that millennium, or at the turn of the century, what we now say is the turn of a millennium. But if we lay out a timeline, you have Jesus' birth, and then we'll call his death 33 AD. And I know there's debate whether it's 30 AD or 33 AD, whatever it is, that's about where it is. Then you have Paul heading out. Paul is going to be going out around 49 AD, and by 55 AD, he's in Ephesus. Now, then, and all of this during this time, John is staying behind in Israel, okay? But then, by 66 to 70 AD, you have the Jewish war with Rome, and you have the destruction of the temple. Then, scholars date John's Gospel somewhere around 95 AD, the very end of the century. So, if we notice the amount of time between Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension and John's Gospel, about 60 years. So we might ask, what was John doing for 60 years? Between 33 AD and the time he gets to Ephesus and then ultimately writes that letter? Well, we don't have it documented. But we know that what Jewish disciples, those early disciples, did was they spent their time memorizing their teachers' lessons, their teachings, Jesus's teachings about the Torah. They're learning how to live out the Torah through the teachings of Jesus. So you're a disciple not only still studying Scripture, but also memorizing what Jesus taught you. You memorize your teacher's lessons. And so at that point, within Jewish schools, they weren't writing down the teachings of their rabbis yet. So John would memorize Jesus' teachings, then he would bring on his own disciple. He would teach them the lessons, along with studying the Torah, showing his own disciples how the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, talks about the Messiah, and then how Jesus fulfilled that. And so you would be teaching over and over and over and over the lessons and the stories of Jesus. That's what they did. They studied Scripture, they memorized the Bible, they memorized their teachers' lessons. And their goal was to become just like their rabbi. So just like Jesus, by living out the teachings. Okay? Now, at some point, John feels compelled to write his gospel for his community. Perhaps at this point you have a lot of Greek converts. Perhaps John used it as a tool to help them memorize Jesus' words and understand his actions, but also to communicate the overall message about who Jesus is. But anyways, at some point, he's writing down his gospel some 62 years later. Okay, so John didn't just move anywhere. He moved to where the heart of that early Christian movement was, okay, and to one of the most important cities in the ancient world. Now, this lesson today is not a class on the city of Ephesus. If you're interested in learning more about this important city, Ephesus, we've got a couple videos, and they're in our series on the 7 churches of Revelation. I'll put the links below in the description section, as well as at the end of this lesson, but it's actually quite helpful for you to understand something about the history and the culture and the gods in these cities that John's going to be writing to, his community. They give you a more concrete image of some of those major characteristics. Because as I mentioned, as we go through the book of John, you have to have one foot in Israel. So we're going to be studying Jewish history, culture, and ways of thinking. And then we're going to have to look at Asia Minor, some of the things that his community would understand, particularly if they're not Jewish. Okay? So one thing to consider when looking at any book of the Bible is, who is the original audience? Who was the original letter written to? And we can start then with these 7 cities, and because these are some of the major cities in Asia Minor. And these, of course, are the cities that we also find in the book of Revelation. So John was pastoring, at least in some way, shape, or form, the churches that existed within these cities, and obviously it would extend to the neighboring cities beyond, but he mentions these in the book of Revelation. So what is it then that John's going to be saying to these cities? Now, if they're Jewish, he's going to have a message for them. If they're Greek, he's going to have a message for them. But what do they need to hear? What do they need to understand from the stories that John chose for his gospel? Because it's the one thing about John is he has different stories than we find in the other 3 gospels. So if we go a little bit closer here, we see that all of these cities right here, these are the 7 cities that show up in the book of Revelation. It goes like this: from Ephesus to Smyrna to Pergamum to Thyatira to Sardis Sardis, by the way, is a very famous, it was a wealthy city, hometown of Aesop. So many of you have seen Aesop's fables. That's where Aesop was from. You have Philadelphia, and the final one that's mentioned in the book of Revelation is Laodicea. Now, there are other cities, though, that you could include, because if you notice, right next to Laodicea is the city of Colossae, and that's where Paul wrote the letter to Colossians. Now, Paul also happened to write a letter to Laodicea. He says, if you look at the end of Colossians, he says, when you're finished with this letter, take it over to the believers in Laodicea. And oh, by the way, get the letter I wrote them and read it to your church. So there's some long-lost letter that probably has all of the things that we're wondering what Paul meant that was written to Laodicea. But anyways, when we get to the end today, we're also going to look at this city right here called Hierapolis, because that's going to come into play in a minute. Okay. Now I want to give you two examples of how this region, the cities, the people, the community, how this ends up showing up in John's gospel. Okay, so I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is the ancient world is full of gods. It's not, today we deal with people who say, I'm not religious, I don't believe they're gods. But the point is, when you're in Asia Minor, everybody has a god. You could have multiple gods, and you don't have an allegiance to any one of them. So if you happen to show up in a city where Zeus is in charge, well, you go make an offering to Zeus. You don't care. You're not offending the other gods by making an offering to Zeus. Okay? So this is going to be considering the culture of Asia Minor. What is John having to deal with? How do his stories then refute what they believe in Asia Minor? Okay? Because it's remarkable. When you show up in that first century, if you say, well, we follow Jesus and he resurrected from the dead, well, the people will look at you and say, so what? So did Dionysus. So did Asclepius. Many of the gods that have to do with agriculture are dying and resurrecting gods. Look to nature. Every year they see the plants die and resurrect. There must be a god behind that. So to simply walk up, see, we get so hung up today in our scientific thinking about the resurrection. Back then, that wasn't the main issue. So one of the questions that you always have to say is, how are they going to differentiate themselves, that early Christian movement, from those other so-called gods? And we'll see how this is going to line up. Now, the way John is going to refute some of these is by the stories that he chooses to tell. So he's adding stories in, Jesus stories, that are going to speak to that culture about one of their gods, okay? So let's do it real quick. This is real quick, and we're not going to be able to go in any way deep into this topic. But let me show you, I'm just going to use at first the I am statements. So there are I am statements. For instance, I am the bread in John 6. Well, there was a Greek goddess called Demeter, and she was the goddess of bread. She's the one who caused the crops to grow and provided bread. It's where we get the word cereal today that comes through the Roman name. But Demeter, she was the bread, right? Jesus says, no, I'm the bread. Then you have I am the light. That's in John 8. Well, Apollo was the light bringer. You have I am the resurrection. That's in John 11. Nope, not to the Greeks. That's Dionysus. He dies and resurrects every year. I am the truth in John 14. Nope. How about Athena? She was a goddess of wisdom and truth. I am the true vine, says Jesus. Not to the Greek world. That's Dionysus again. So you can see what is happening is he's using these declarations by Jesus in a way that's going to speak to that culture to say, these are false gods. And Jesus is all of that. Okay? Now, we'll also see some stories, for instance, the water to wine story, only told in John. Well, one of the major gods, very popular in Asia Minor, is Dionysus. And Dionysus is said to turn water into wine every year on his birthday. And so John includes that story because it speaks to the audience that's there in Asia Minor. And we'll see that when Jesus healed a lame man at Bethesda, that's in John 5, it's going to go directly against Asclepius. And you'll see when we get there that archaeologists even found a shrine to Asclepius at the pools of Bethesda, probably brought there by the Roman soldiers. But Asclepius was a god who was supposedly able to heal and even bring people back from the dead. So Jesus raises the dead. In John 11, well, of course, Asclepius is able to raise the dead. And then at one point, Jesus has a discourse in chapter 6, in John 6, about you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. And that was, of course, it even says in there that that was difficult for the Jewish hearers of this. But within the worship of Dionysus, this was part of the ritual at Pergamum, is you would drink. See, Dionysus is the god of party and wine. And so they would sacrifice a bull and get drunk on wine. And when you drink the wine, you become one with the spirit of Dionysus. That's why they're called spirits. So they transform you. Then you eat the meat. You ingest the meat of Dionysus because you want to become one with Dionysus. You want to become infused the spirit of Dionysus, which is really what the New Testament is talking about as we have Christ in us. Okay, but of course, Dionysus is a false god, and it leads you down a path of destruction, really. We're going to see over and over and over and over, if we look at the culture of Asia Minor, how John is using these stories to refute what would be very common in their eyes. Okay? Now, let me show you something. Not too many years later, okay? This comes from, we call him Justin Martyr. Justin was an early Christian apologist. He was actually born a Greek. He became a Christian later in life, and he lived from about 100 AD to 65 AD. And so his writings are excellent. In one of his early apologies, he's arguing against the Greek gods and the Greek religions. Now, he's very close to this writing of John and that early church. But I want to show you one because I want to show you how many of those Greek gods that John is refuting, okay, are going to flow into what Justin is doing, the same thing. Okay, so this comes from the first apology of Justin, that's chapter 15. And it says this, and secondly, because we, who out of every race of men, used to worship Bacchus. Now, Bacchus is another name for Dionysus. So they used to worship Bacchus or Dionysus, the son of Semele. And then you have Apollo, the son of Latona. Okay, and you can see he's naming all of these gods and goddesses that everybody used to worship. Then he gets down here, he says, or Asclepius. So we have three right there that I've already mentioned, Dionysus, Apollo, Asclepius, or someone or other of those who are called gods. Now he's saying, look, we used to worship them. We have now, through Jesus Christ, learned to despise these. And even though we've been threatened for death for it, we've dedicated ourselves to the unbegotten and the impassible God. Now here's the thing. In that ancient world, everybody is religious. Everybody has a God. And the problem they had with not only Judaism, but then Christianity, is within Judaism and Christianity, you're loyal to only one God. So the Jews and the Christians would only acknowledge one God. In the Greek world, it doesn't matter. You can honor any of those gods. If you were a worshiper of Dionysus, but you moved to Ephesus for some reason, well, in Ephesus, Artemis is the goddess. She's the protector of the city. So you better make your offerings to Artemis. Because what if you don't? What if Artemis gets mad? What if Artemis stops protecting our wonderful city because of you? And so there would be tremendous pressure, and there's tremendous anxiety and superstition that if you don't make the right offering to the right God at the right moment in the right place, that you're not going to get blessed. It's all about appeasing that God. And so now you have the Christians and the Jews, and they won't make an offering to Artemis, and they won't go to the Dionysus festivals, and they won't make an offering to Zeus. And now everybody says, what if the gods get angry? Who are you to not acknowledge our gods? And it creates a huge tension within the society, because people now start to blame anything that goes bad on those Christians that won't worship our gods, and now the gods got mad. And so you can see how crazy this would get. Okay, that's one example. We're going to be talking about the different gods within Asia Minor and that ancient world, but John is having to deal with that, and he does through the stories that he chooses to put within the gospel, okay? Now, let me give you one final example. This is a quick one that seems to come out of John's experience there in Ephesus, and it ends up in his gospel letter, and it has to do with one of Jesus's disciples, Philip. Okay, so Philip is only mentioned one time in each of the first three Gospels. So they each have the word Philip once. There's no stories about him, simply his name, okay, when you list the disciples. But then we go to John, and Philip's name shows up all over the place. It's actually there 12 times. The stories of Philip are found throughout John's Gospel. Now, again, just like we questioned why go to Ephesus, why would John choose that city to go to? We ask the same question. Why? Why so much about Philip? Why no Philip in the other Gospels, but suddenly there's all this about Philip? Now, we could say, first of all, John and Philip are both from Bethsaida, right? And you can imagine if you grew up together, you were in school together. Bethsaida is a teeny small town in Galilee, a couple hundred people. They probably knew each other their entire lives. So maybe they're friends. And John uses a lot of the Philip stories for that reason. But I think there's a better one, and this has to do with being in Ephesus, okay? And the natural community. So John's initial audience, even though millions of people will eventually read this letter over the next thousands of years, John had an intended audience there in Asia Minor, okay? And where did Philip end up moving to? Well, he ended up bringing his family right here to the city called Hierapolis, across from Laodicea. Now, this is interesting because, again, why include so many stories of Philip? Well, who's the original audience? It's everybody there in that region. They all know Phil. Phil comes to their annual convention in Ephesus. They invite Philip to their churches to tell stories about Jesus. He's another disciple of Jesus, and he's living there at Hierapolis. And so clearly it would make sense that John and Philip would be in ministry together, that Philip would be assisting in this and backing up the stories and telling his own stories about Jesus. It's remarkable to me that the one gospel letter that includes so much about Philip lives right down the street from John. And it makes total sense then that if we understand that where these disciples end up and that community, we would say, aha, that's the reason John's including so much about Philip, because his initial audience knows Philip. So one of the things, and this comes from a scholar named Kenneth Bailey, he passed away a few years ago. Ken Bailey would say, look, the Bible letters were written for us. They're for us, meaning we can engage them, but they weren't written to us. And so his passion was, let's look at who they were written to first and try to understand the meaning before we read them ourselves because they are for us as well. So anyways, just an interesting thought. Why did John include Philip? Well, he's right next to John in Ephesus. So the whole point to this is just to show you that we have to pay attention to where the letter was written, to that region of Asia Minor, to his very first audience, because John is connecting to his audience in a unique way. Now, ultimately, the argument we're going to be making is a Jewish argument, right? That Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. He's the King of Israel. That's one of the major points of John's letter. Jesus is the King of Israel. So no doubt this is a very Jewish document. John's very familiar with Jerusalem and the land of Israel, but he's also connecting with those people in Asia Minor. And this, of course, comes to all cultural aspects, right? We don't pull it from John's letter. We have to understand something about we have to understand something about the culture, and then John's letter makes sense to us. Okay? So just like what we're going to have to do with Israel and Galilee, we'll do with Asia Minor. The more we know about these cultures, the customs, the way of thinking, some of the Greek thinking we'll talk about next week when we begin the Logos, because we have to talk about the history of the Logos, is you're going to see how this is all coming together in just a fabulous, amazing, it's like a kaleidoscope of a gospel. It's absolutely an amazing gospel that John wrote us. Okay, next week, we're going to start in the history of the word logos, or, as we'll find out, the Aramaic memra.